We'll get started. So let's welcome our speaker today, Lance.
Thank you. All right, thank you, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. We tried to come up with a catchy title, Behind the Curtain. We thought that would be maybe fun and pull some people in, and I was thinking about it, and I'll introduce myself a little bit more in a minute, but I'm a Kansas native, and so I thought, oh, Wizard of Oz, right? I can really do something fun with this. And then it hit me that, what do they say? Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. I thought, well, that's going to be an awful way to present this, but it was already done. So that's what we're going to do today. So before I get too far into things, I just want to share a little bit of information about me. My name is Lance Honig. I currently serve as the chair of the Agricultural Statistics Board, as well as the director of the Methodology Division at NASS. If you don't know, NASS is the National Agricultural Statistics Service. I'll talk a little bit more about who we are specifically, but as the chair of the Agricultural Statistics Board, in a nutshell, what that means is that I lead the production and dissemination of a lot of our market-sensitive reports that we do. Think about the lockup process, things of that nature. But just a little bit more about who I am. I mentioned that I am from Kansas. My family farms in northeast Kansas. My dad and brothers still farm primarily corn and soybeans and cattle. Seems as though hogs were a big thing when a lot more kids were at home. Once we all left, so did the hogs. I don't know if there's a correlation there or not. I am a Kansas State University grad. Been with NASS for a little over 34 years. So as you know, I mentioned what I do today. A lot of you may or may not know me as the longtime crops branch chief. I did that for about 15 years. Or you might just know me as LH out on X because I host our monthly Stat Chat event that we do out there. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while as well. So what we're going to talk about today? Well, obviously I want to share a little bit about who we are. I've got kind of a short list of topics I want to touch on. I could do probably a 3-day workshop on what we do at NASS, and hopefully once I get going I will be able to stop before we hit the 3-day mark. That's my goal. But I try to boil it down to a little bit about who we are, the big picture of what we do, and then touch on 2 or 3 topics that I tend to get the most questions about. And when I say the most questions, what I really mean are the questions that there seem to be a lot of confusion around. And that's why you'll see topics on here like the who's of USDA estimates. I get a lot of questions about work that we don't necessarily do at NASS, but it's closely correlated, and so I want to share some about that. I want to talk about where our data comes from. I'll talk a little bit about balance sheets and revisions. I know that's a hot button topic whenever we revise numbers. And in a group like this, I certainly would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about the importance of survey response. And then I'll wrap things up with a little talk about how we try to do everything we can, including events like this, to be as transparent about the work that we do and how we know it impacts each and every one of you. And if I've done this right, that'll leave time at the end for some questions. All right, so let's start big picture. Who is NASS? Well, specifically, I already mentioned we're a part of USDA. In fact, we're the statistical arm. And our mission is very simple. It's simply to provide timely, accurate, and useful statistics in service to U.S. agriculture. And that means everybody in U.S. agriculture. Structurally, we have 12 regional field offices staged across the U.S. You can see the color-coded regions on the map showing you exactly how those regions are identified. Our main headquarters in Washington, D.C., but we also have a national processing center in St. Louis where a lot of our forms are handled and things of that nature. In a nutshell, we're about publishing data. We consume a lot of data from you, and we turn that into data that we publish in terms of primarily reports across the year. In fact, about 450 reports that we publish each year. You can see more than 100 different crop commodities, 40 different livestock commodities, and in addition to those 450 reports, we're also responsible for the Census of Agriculture every 5 years. When we talk about these 450 reports, You see a calendar on the left side of the screen. I certainly don't expect you to be able to read that. It's just there as a visual aid to show that we schedule every one of these reports about a year in advance. And not only do we schedule them to the day, but you know down to the minute exactly when those reports are going to be released. And that's a key component of how we make everything available to everyone at exactly the same time. In order for that to be effective, you need to know what time that's going to be. And so we do that each and every year to ensure that the information is distributed fairly to everyone. So why NASS data? What's the importance of all this information that we produce? On the left side of the screen, you can see all the different categories of people who are consumers of this information. On the right side, you can see some bullet items in terms of how that data actually gets used. And yes, I did put farmers at the top of the list, and a lot of times farmers will tell me, I don't use your data. I don't even read your reports. And that may be true from a direct standpoint, but you are using information somewhere, somehow from someone, and I would almost guarantee you that those individuals that you are getting advice or information from are utilizing the NASS data somewhere in their process to help provide information back to you. And so sometimes we may not be the first line, but we are the ultimate source of where folks are getting that information. But in addition to that, our policymakers rely very heavily on information to make decisions, and so it's always better if they have good, unbiased information to do that. A lot of the businesses, a lot of the folks we see over in the trade show floor, in fact, many of them have stopped by our booth over there to mention how much they need the information to make sure that they can provide the services back to you where you are. They need to know who needs what where. And the best way to know that is to know what's grown and produced where each and every year. And the list would go on to include our USDA partners, many of the programs that are in place to help support the activities that you need rely very heavily on the information provided by NASS. But at the bottom of the screen might be the most important thing I talk about when I share with you why NASS data matters. And that is because we, as we like to say, levels the playing field. In other words, things are going to be known, at least by some, but in order for everyone to have the data equally, you need someone like NASS who is going to make it available to everyone free of charge at the same time. If we're not there to kind of balance things out, those with the larger resources are going to know more. That's just the way the world works. And so in a sense, when we talk about leveling the playing field, you might even think of it as providing accountability to some of the larger folks out there who might be able to control things a bit more if they were the only ones holding the information. All right, I'll transition a little bit now into I think on the agenda I called it the who's of USDA data. There's really two main, there's a lot of different folks at USDA that are producing data. I'm not going to dispute that fact, but when it comes to data that gets published, information gets released, a lot of the questions I get, like I mentioned, have to do with things that we don't even do at NASS. And so I want to talk a little bit specifically about the difference between what NASS does and what our friends at the World Agricultural Outlook Board do. And so first I'll talk about NASS. NASS, as I mentioned, is the USDA statistical arm. Our task is to measure all aspects of agriculture in the U.S. From a crop perspective, that means acreage, yield, production, price, value, a variety of other items along the way, but that's in a nutshell what we do. And so think of us as the folks responsible for the monthly crop production report that comes out each and every month, since it's monthly. But at the same time, when that crop production report is released, there's also a WSDA report that gets released. And that is not NASS that's publishing the WSDA report. That is a coordinated effort. The World Agricultural Outlook Board is responsible for that. They are a unit within the Office of the Chief Economist. But when it comes to the WSDA report, it's done by committee with a number of folks from across USDA. That would include folks from AMS, ERS, FAS, and I just put FPAC, which could be FSA, RMA, other folks within that mission area. And their task with the WSDA is to provide projections for the world on an ongoing basis. And so again, that's what you would see in those monthly WSDA reports. So you've got NASS on the one hand, focusing on the US. You've got the WSDA report focusing on the world. There's going to be some overlap because the US is a key contributor to what's happening in the world. And so as you can see in the bubble at the bottom of the screen, the WSDA report will incorporate NASS estimates for the US when they're available. And so that's where part of the confusion comes in, because the WSDA report is sometimes reporting on things happening in the US before NASS has entered into the scene for a given season. So to put a little bit of picture around that, just to talk about corn, soybeans, and sorghum, because they operate on the same schedule. Everything I talk about today, I'll probably put a bit of a corn and soybean slant to it. We basically use the same process and procedures across all of our crops, and really to some degree all of our commodities. But the timing and counts and things of that nature can vary a little bit. And so what I've provided for you today, we'll really use corn and soybeans as the guide. And so looking here at what happens across USDA between both NASS and the World Board for a given crop season, I chose the 24-25 season, meaning the crop that was produced and harvested in 24 but will be marketed through parts of 2025. I've laid out for you a schedule of who is responsible for any estimates that you would see published for the key components, planted, harvested, yield, production, and ending stocks on a monthly basis. And as you can see, going month by month, sometimes it's NASS, sometimes it's the World Board. So why do I even bother to point out the fact that there's a difference? Because the methodology is different. And so I think it's important for you to understand where those numbers come from, because how they come about is a little bit different based on who was responsible at the time. And so for example, when NASS is responsible for that number, it means that it is based on a combination of survey data, administrative data, and satellite indicated data for that growing season. And so it is what I guess I would call live data for the crop that is growing and developing or has already been produced for that given season. If the World Board is responsible for that number, then it is likely based on just a combination of weather information, trend analysis, and other pieces of market intelligence. And so certainly not suggesting that they don't do a great job, because they do. They do a fantastic job, but the methodology is simply different. And so in a nutshell, it's based on these points that I mentioned, really nothing to do with any ground truthing for what is happening in the given season. And so I think that's a key thing that you need to know as you're looking at those numbers that come out from USDA. For example, you saw some planting forecast numbers come out earlier this month from USDA. Those are not NASS numbers, and so they have nothing to do with any information that we've collected from farmers. They have nothing to do with any information that's been provided to other parts of USDA. They are based largely on trend analysis and other market intelligence that they have at this point. So if we zoom in a little bit closer on NASS, and where does the data specifically come from that we base all of our estimates and forecasts on? It's hundreds of surveys that we conduct every year, and you probably all know that, because many of you feel like you get all 100 surveys that happen from NASS on an ongoing basis, and I'm sure you fill them all out and send them back as well. But if we talk about corn and soybeans and acres yield and production, there's really three major categories of surveys that we focus on. So I wanted to share a little information about those. The first is what we would call our agricultural surveys. You can see these are large surveys. In fact, they range from anywhere around 55,000 in June to about 75,000 in December. And so these are large sample size surveys that we do, because we're using them to focus in on estimating acreage and final yield and production at the end of the season. And then we also collect our on-farm stocks from there. And so because of the nature of what we're collecting, we need a lot of data And we need that data to come from a large swath of producers across the country. And those sample sizes are pretty large, and the questionnaires are a little bit longer than the second category I'm going to mention. That's our agricultural yield surveys. These are short, quick surveys that we do during the growing season. You can see May through November, the May, June, and July are focusing on our small grain crops, but August through November is where we really get into the row crops. And you can see the sample sizes are much, much smaller than what we do on those quarterly agricultural surveys. In fact, the largest sample we see in August is just around 14,000. And so not only are the sample sizes smaller, the survey forms are much shorter, because all we need to know at that point is what do you expect your yields to be this season. And so since we need much less information, and because we're only looking to get yield, which is something that can be a little bit more contiguous in areas, we can do that with a much smaller sample size. You might look at a chart like this and think, well, why are they different every month? Well, that would be because we actually ask about different crops each and every month. And so in August, you see the largest sample size. That's because we are focused on the largest number of crops that we do in any given month. As the season goes on, some of those crops fall out of the mix, and we're able to settle with a little bit smaller sample size. And then the last survey type that we use, focusing on yield specifically, is our objective yield. And so up to this point, I've talked about surveys that we send to farmers when we ask you to report information to us. The objective yield surveys work a little bit differently. We actually lay out plots in selected fields in the key growing areas for corn, soybeans, and winter wheat. And rather than asking you what your yields are expected to be, we will actually send our trained enumerators in to look at those plots month after month. They will take counts, they will take measurements. Ultimately, as the crop matures, they'll actually harvest portions of those plots, send them to our lab in St. Louis, and we will use that information to determine what yields are expected to be for those various locations. And so those are the three cornerstone surveys that we use to gather the information we need for acres yield and production on these major crops. So what might that actually look like visually? Up on the upper left corner here, that is a map that shows the typical sample distribution that we would see from our December agricultural survey. Remember, that was the largest of the 4 quarters in terms of sample, because we're trying to estimate final acres yield and production for the major crops across the country. And so each of those little purple dots, which I know you can't make out the individual dots, but part of that is because there are so many dots. We've got nearly 73,000 dots across that map, and you can see they're highly concentrated in the key growing areas. And just to show the comparison about how much smaller the sample sizes are for those monthly yield surveys that we do, notice how much harder it is to see dots on that map, because they are much, much more sparse. But what's interesting, if you look at that map, and I know it washes out a little bit on a large screen in a room like this, but the concentration probably isn't exactly where you thought it would be, right? You're not seeing the deepest combination of dots necessarily in the heart of corn and soybean country, and that's because we are strictly looking at yield, and because yields are so much more consistent in some of the key growing areas, we actually have to focus more efforts on the areas where the yield tends to be more dispersed. And then last but not least on this slide, you can see at the bottom the objective yield samples. And again, we're talking about, this happens to be for corn. There's only about 1,500 of these samples that we lay out. They're focused in 10 states, and so I know that washed out a little bit on the map. But the point is, we don't need nearly as many samples for that work as well. So that's the survey side of things. That is not the only source of information we use. It is the key source of information, but we do look at other types of data. The first is satellite data. I get a lot of questions about this. Why don't you just use satellite information? Well, first off, let me just clear up, we do use satellite information. And in fact, from an acreage standpoint, the big product that we produce each year is called the Cropland Data Layer. This was just released last week. That is a look at the cropland data layer, and based strictly on what we see from satellites and the modeling we've done with the different signals that those crops produce, each color on that map represents a different crop. And we can use that to model acreage across the country, and it does pretty well. But it has its limitations. And so much like I will do with this slide and the next slide, it's a little bit of color coding here. From a satellite perspective for planted acreage, the green box represents what's good about it. And what is good about it is that we've got great coverage, especially for the major crops. And that's probably not a surprise to anyone. The downside is that it takes time before you can measure the crops that are growing based on satellite information. First of all, the crops actually have to be up and growing. That's not a big shock. But by the time that happens and we're at a point where we can process that and identify all of those crops by acreage, you're going to see on the next slide that this is no longer the best source of information that we have. So put that in your back pocket for now. From a yield perspective, we also look at satellite information. I talked about 2 major surveys a moment ago, right? We survey you as producers to ask your expectations of yield, and we also put our objective yield plots out. But at the same time, we're also looking at modeled yields from the satellites. And so what is good about that in the green box is that that's pretty quick. We can get a very quick modeled yield based on satellite information throughout the growing season. The problem is it can be a little bit questionable in terms of how accurate those modeled results are. In fact, if things are perfectly normal and nothing out of the ordinary happens, this will work very well. But the question I would ask is, when was the last time everything was very normal and nothing outside of the ordinary happened? That's when this can start to provide a little less reliable results. And so it is a great supplement to our survey work, but in all the work that we have done, we have not seen that it has proven to be as accurate as the satellite information that we have. So we've talked about survey information, we've talked about the satellite data. Here's one of the biggest questions I get all the time is, why don't you just get the information from FSA? I already reported everything to them. You can just go there and get it. Well, there's 2 issues there. Number 1, do you report your planted acreage, your harvested acreage, and your yield to FSA? No. You do report your planted area. Absolutely, certified acreage. And it is number 1 on our list for administrative data for planted acreage. It is fantastic. In fact, I put greater than 98% coverage for some crops. It is even higher. And so that is the green box for the FSA certified acreage information. And I can tell you 100%, once that data are complete or near complete, we absolutely use it. In fact, that becomes the primary source of information that feeds our planted acreage estimates as early as August for corn and soybeans starting last year. But that also leads to a bit of a challenge that comes with it. It is not until August that we can use FSA acreage to determine how many acres of corn and soybeans are grown in the U.S. And so we publish a prospective plantings report at the end of March, and we publish an acreage report at the end of June, estimating what the planted area is going to be for those crops. We simply can't do that with FSA acreage that early in the season because it is not complete. And so it has its challenges. RMA data, pretty high percentage coverage there as well. Basically, it'd be the indemnified acreage, but timing becomes an even bigger challenging there. And quite frankly, even at its best, it's hard to beat the FSA certified acreage information. So yes, we absolutely use FSA certified acreage information. It is a wonderful proxy for planted area. Harvested area, things start to get a little bit more challenging when it comes to administrative data. I listed RMA here first because it's more complete than FSA. It is, though, really just a minimum indication. We don't get everything reported to RMA, but it is pretty high. But the big challenge here really comes, we really don't see a complete accounting of that from an insurance perspective until the next spring. And so, again, great information, but timing prevents it from being a substitute for the other sources of data like surveys that we use. And from an FSA perspective on harvested area, it's really pretty minimal because you really don't have a lot of incentive to go back to your FSA office to report acres that's failed. And so that's not terribly valuable to us. And then from a yield standpoint, again, nothing reported to FSA. We do see a lot of data reported through the crop insurance program to RMA, but the big challenge there is that we're talking June or July of the following year before that data become complete and available to us. And so long after the season is complete. And so yes, we do utilize this administrative data every opportunity we have, but is not a replacement for the survey data for the reasons that I've shared here. Just a quick reminder, since I've really been focused on acres yield and production, from a stocks perspective, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we do collect all the on-farm stocks from the same quarterly surveys that we use to capture acreage and production. And then to capture the portion stored in the commercial facilities, we do have a separate survey that we do for those folks each and every quarter to gather that information. So it is a reporting. I know I'm running a little bit longer than I hoped, so I'll run fairly quickly from here on. Balance sheet, I don't want to go into too much detail here, other than to mention that we do utilize the balance sheet to help us fine-tune our estimates. Obviously it depends on the crop, but we've got measures of inputs and outputs when it comes to these crops. For a crop like soybeans, we measure almost everything. And so when we look at a residual or that difference between what the accounting would suggest and what our surveys say, that residual will be very small, and we will rely pretty heavily on the balance sheet to help us fine-tune things there. When it comes to a crop like corn, there is no measure for feed use. And so exactly how much feed use there is, or in this case we call it residual, but let's just be honest, it's mostly feed use. Generally speaking, we're using the balance sheet to kind of help keep everything in check. And so we look at our survey data, we look at the balance sheet, and we find the appropriate levels in there that fall within our survey bounds, but also satisfy the balance sheet that we are looking at. And sometimes that can lead to a revision situation. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted to touch on a few topics that tend to be hot buttons with folks, and I know revisions is one of them. I know as a producer it's frustrating when we turn around a year later and publish a revision to yield for the previous season or something of that nature. But it really comes down to timing, because when we talk about using that balance sheet as an accounting tool, we don't know until the marketing season is over what those measures are. And so just to look at this graphic, I kind of harvested the chart I showed you at the beginning of the program that outlined when different parts of USDA estimate things. As you can see, for example, for this crop that we just harvested, in January we published those final production numbers, acres, yield, production. But it's not until we get to September this year that we're going to have a final balance sheet. And so although we have done our best to estimate as closely as possible to those final yields, if the balance sheet tells us something different at the end of the season, we want to make sure that we adjust to provide the most accurate measure of the 24 production that we possibly can. We do that for two reasons. One, because we want to provide the most accurate estimates possible. And number two, in the statistical world, history helps inform what happens moving forward. And so the more accurate we can get data for this year, the better job we're going to be able to do estimating the crop coming up this next season. And so it really is to not only our advantage, but yours, if we can make those adjustments and get the data out there as accurately as possible. Real quickly, I want to talk about kind of how this sample coverage that or the sample counts that we use, how they really represent accurately measuring what's happening across the country. I've got a couple of maps here. First, the cropland data layer. I showed you this earlier. This is the satellite mapping we do of the crops that were grown this past season. The green and the yellow, no surprise, that's corn and soybeans. On the right, just a repeat of that sample distribution of our December Ag Survey. And look what happens if we drop those samples over the top of the cropland data layer. The fact that you can't tell what crops are growing on here as clearly simply indicates that we are making sure that our samples fall in the areas where the crops are grown. And so as long as you're not seeing a ton of color shining through, that means that we've got good sample coverage and we are collecting data that is representative of what is being grown and produced across the country. Now next I want to show you what happens if we don't get good response on those surveys. So on the left is, again, the same map I've shown you of the sample distribution for December. On the right, what we've done is we have just randomly removed 40% of those dots. And so notice how much different the picture looks if we get, in this example, a 60% response rather than 100% response. And look, if we superimpose that over the cropland data layer, how much more question that leaves around whether or not we've got good coverage across the growing area. And I would point out that in this particular example, we simply randomly removed 40% of those dots. But what happens if that's not random? What happens if we've got pockets across the country where response is even lower? And you've probably seen that in recent years as you've tried to look at your local county level estimates and said, why am I not seeing my county? If we didn't get enough responses in your county, then we can't accurately measure your acreage and yield, and therefore we're not going to be able to publish an estimate. But it's not just at the county level. It can impact the state numbers and it can impact the national numbers. And so the single greatest thing you can do as a producer to help make sure these numbers are as accurate as possible is respond to the surveys. The last few slides I wanted to share, just talk a little bit more about how we try to be transparent with the work that we do. One thing that's kind of an overlap between transparency and, quite frankly, just answering a question we always get. Folks tell me all the time, your reports only drive prices down. The prices only drop when you publish reports. We actually have a report that we publish that tracks that called Price Reactions. The link's at the bottom of the screen. The top three charts here show you from 1985 to 2023, the day after the crop production report was issued, for example, for corn, you can see the green portion of the chart shows the number of times the corn price went up the next day. The red portion shows the number of times the price went down. The top middle is soybean prices, wheat prices on the right. The bottom is a week after. And so if you focus on a week after crop production comes out, you can't get much closer to half the time it goes up and half the time it goes down. But it's human nature to only remember the times it goes down. So I understand that. But I just want to... I'm sorry? Well, it's pretty even on the bottom. Just a couple other things that we do. For the real data nerds out there, and I was told earlier that there are a few in the room, we do publish what we call methodology and quality measure reports for most of our key releases that we do as well, and that will include information about the methodology we use. It'll have more details on sample sizes, survey response rates, something we call weighted item response, and then also the CV. So you can see the statistical variability around the indications that we capture. We've got tons of documents out on our website that talk more about specifically what we do. And in fact, in recent years, we've done some other things to try to increase our transparency. For example, you'll see a lot of gray boxes on the front of our reports. Anytime anything unusual happened, we try to stick a gray box at the front and just make sure you know that, hey, this is something that was going on. We want to draw your attention to it. We don't know how it might have impacted the results, but we want you to know. And then one of the big things we've done is the Stat Chat series that I talked about earlier, something that we do on X. After every major report, I actually go on either an hour and a half after the report, and you can ask me questions directly. And so many of you might only know me as LH, because when I'm on the NASS X account, that's how I identify myself. And then at the bottom of the screen, you can see we've got just tons of information out on the website that talk more specifically about what we do, including some simple one-page documents that can talk about things like, hey, what exactly is included in a planted acreage estimate or a harvested acreage estimate? Or how exactly do you capture this situation for yield? Or how do you use FSA data? We've got one-pagers out there to address certain things like that. And then we've got the deep dives as well for the true data nerds or those who have trouble sleeping, quite frankly. And so just real quickly, again, more on the stat chat. For example, when Prospective Plantings is published on March 31st at noon Eastern Time, 1:30 Eastern Time, you can go on to X and ask me all the questions you want about that or the grain stocks report that day. Last but not least, come visit a lockup. These most market-sensitive reports are issued out of a lockup environment, and yes, you can come visit an actual lockup. And so we would encourage you to do that. If you don't want to do that, or if you aren't able to do that, you can still watch the briefing that we do for the Secretary as those reports are released. They're live streamed on the NASS YouTube channel. Lots of exciting content on the NASS YouTube channel, as you might imagine. But you can certainly go out and watch those live, or you can catch the recordings because we post them out there afterwards as well. And so with that, I'm going to wrap things up so that we've got a few minutes left for questions. If you don't have a chance to get your question answered here today, though, we do have a booth, number 720, over in the trade show floor, and we'll certainly be happy to answer any questions you've got there as well. So as was mentioned earlier, we've got a couple of mics in the room. If you've got any questions, I would be happy to take those now. There we go. Yes, sir. Or ma'am. It's a race to the mic.
What sort of a response rate do you need to have confidence in your numbers, percentage-wise?
So the higher the better, obviously, right? And so OMB would suggest to us that we should set a goal of 80%. And so that's certainly a target that we will set. In the last 5 to 6 years, I would say we saw a little bit of a dip in the response. It's leveled off recently. And so there's a reason that I said I would randomly remove 40% of the dots on that agricultural survey map, and that's because 60% has become a more common level for those type of surveys. And then on the monthly ag yield surveys, we tend to run more in the 70s, quite frankly. Again, shorter, quicker surveys, and so we know response is a bit higher. But what I would point out is that when we know we are getting lower response, we have to make adjustments, and those adjustments can include increasing sample sizes and things of that nature. And so it's a balancing act between how large the sample needs to be with what the response is like. And so not only can increased response directly improve accuracy, it can also help us be more efficient by lowering the number of folks that we need to attempt to contact. So, great question. Yes, sir.
About 25 years ago, I did my first survey, and the enumerator that came was also looking for someone to replace her, so my wife took that job, and she worked for about 17 years. But over that time, we noticed that, or at least it appeared that you were continuing to have to try and do more and better with less. Budget constraints seemed like a continual problem. And is that continuing? Is that a concern? What's going on there in that arena?
Sure. And you know, I think much like you would encounter on your own operations. I think we're always going to want to try to be as efficient as we can possibly be. We're always going to look for ways to try to do more with less, quite frankly. We've gone through some lean years over that time period. Sometimes the budget is a little bit more challenging than others, but we always find a way to operate within the bounds that we're given. We will continue to do that moving forward. We never know what next year's budget is going to look like until we get it, but once we do, we will do everything we can to continue to meet our mission within those targets that we're given. All right, I see 2 minutes left on the clock here.
Well, I'm sure glad I don't have your job. The only thing worse would be IRS tax collector, I think. But so thank you, I guess, especially for the bullish reports. But yeah, I mean, you know, obviously it's, as you've shown, you do a fair job. Would AI help in anything and how, but don't say that too loud because those may be listening.
Yeah, so I mean, AI is kind of a broad term, right? I mean, it's machine learning, AI, and so there's a lot of different ways you can look at that. So I would say even up to this point, there are ways that we can utilize machine learning and things of that nature to help process information, utilize the information that we have as efficiently as possible. And I think as that field continues to evolve, there could be opportunities to greatly enhance the use in that space. But we'll see what happens in the next couple of years, I think, because that's a really timely topic, and I think things are changing very rapidly there. Yes?
Yeah, if we have time, thank you. Thank you for your presentation as well. We've had a lot of acres that have gone to solar, and I know a number of those farmland owners do get survey reports. Are you able to parse that out in the farmland rent estimates? Because it ends up educating a lot of things, those numbers.
Yeah, so most of the survey work that we do is obviously focused specifically on capturing the crops that are grown, right? When I talk about crops, obviously we do a lot of work around livestock, other commodities and things of that nature as well. And so most of these surveys that I talked about, we're asking how many acres of the various crops are you growing, and so we're not necessarily asking what you're not doing with those various acres. Now, we do have the Census of Agriculture that we do every 5 years where we can capture specific topics like that and get information about specific topics. But on an ongoing basis, we're really focusing pretty heavily on the commodities themselves.
So you're not aware of any instances, they wouldn't be commingled in at all then? It would be
The solar acres?
Yeah, that's right.
They shouldn't be included in the acres for these crops because they're not the same acres. That's right.
The cropland data layer can give you an indication of acres that are moving from one land use to another.
Right.
You know, it's that, some of those maps can show you moving from crops to concrete, or crops to solar and stuff. So those go into non-agricultural.
Yep. And we do have a pretty neat product out there that utilizes the cropland data layer to show change over time. And so that's a great example, Joe, of how you could utilize some of the satellite information there to watch some of the changes that have happened. Okay, maybe, I think that pretty much wraps us up, actually. I thought maybe I had a minute left, but I think I went a minute over. So thanks again, everybody, for joining. I really appreciate you being here. Just a reminder, we'll be at booth 720 if you've got any additional questions, or I'll hang around here afterwards as well if you want to chat a little bit. So thanks again. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoy the rest of the show.